Dorset, September 1812. The position had been advertised in the manner of a household that considered discretion a higher virtue than generosity, which is to say, the advertisement was small, the salary was adequate, and the requirements were impossible. Governess wanted for the household of His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth. Applicant must possess fluency in French, competence in Latin, a working knowledge of mathematics and natural philosophy, experience with children of particular temperament, and the disposition to maintain silence in all matters relating to the family. The word silence had been underlined. Twice. Sir Anne Lydgate read the advertisement on a Wednesday morning in a parlor in Bath that smelled of lavender and diminished expectations. She was 26. She had been a governess for 9 years, which meant she had entered the profession at 17, which meant something had happened at 17 that had made the profession necessary, and she did not discuss what that something was with the same consistency that she did not discuss her mother's family or her father's debts, or the particular quality of education she had received before the money disappeared. She had her mother's languages and her father's mathematics and her own capacity for silence, which was not the absence of thought, but the disciplined management of it. And she had decided by Wednesday afternoon that she would apply for the position at Ashworth Hall, because the salary was adequate and the location was remote, and because the word silence in the advertisement, underlined twice, told her something about the household that the household had not intended to reveal. A house that required silence was a house that had something it did not want spoken about. She arrived at Ashworth Hall on the second Monday of September, having traveled from Bath by mail coach, and then by a hired cart from the village of Thornford, which sat at the bottom of the valley, like a place that had been put there and then forgotten about by everyone except the people who lived in it. The hall itself was visible from 2 miles away, which was the point of it. It sat on the ridge above the valley, limestone and glass, and formal gardens descending in terraces toward the river, the kind of house that had been built to be seen from a distance and to make the distance feel intentional. She noted the house. She noted the gardens. She noted the state of the drive, which was well maintained but not recently graveled, which told her something about where the money was going and where it was not. The housekeeper met her at the side entrance, which told her something. Mrs. Calder was a woman of perhaps 50, with the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who had been running large houses for decades and had stopped wasting energy on anything that did not require it. She looked at Sir Anne with the brief, complete assessment of a woman who had seen a great many governesses arrive at this door and had watched most of them leave again within the season. Miss Lydgate, Mrs. Calder, you are earlier than expected. The coach was favorable. Mrs. Calder turned and led her through the service corridor toward the main house with the pace of a woman who did not repeat herself and did not slow down. The children, Mrs. Calder said as they walked. There are 2. Lady Blythe is 11. Lord Orrin is 7. Lady Blythe has not spoken to a governess in 8 months. Lord Orrin has not stopped speaking to anyone in 7 years. You will find the contrast instructive. She paused at the foot of the back stairs. His Grace does not involve himself in the schoolroom. He does not take meals with the children. He does not wish to be consulted on matters of curriculum or discipline unless the matter is severe. He will meet you this afternoon at 4 in the study. The meeting will be brief. His Grace prefers all meetings to be brief. She looked at Sir Anne with the expression of a woman delivering a warning in the shape of information. Do you have questions? What happened to the last governess? Sir Anne asked. Mrs. Calder's expression did not change. She had questions, Mrs. Calder said, and then she led her upstairs. The study at Ashworth Hall was on the first floor, east-facing, which meant it received the morning light and was in shadow by the afternoon, which was when the Duke chose to conduct his business in it, which told Sir Anne everything she needed to know about whether the Duke of Ashworth preferred clarity or controlled darkness when speaking to people he employed. She arrived at 4. She had spent the intervening hours in the schoolroom, which was well supplied and poorly organized, and in the nursery corridor, where she had met Lord Orrin, who had introduced himself, his wooden horse, his collection of interesting rocks, and his opinion on the weather, all within the first 90 seconds. And Lady Blythe, who had looked at her from the window seat with the flat, measuring gaze of a child who had decided that all adults were temporary and was not interested in investing in another one. Serene had looked back at her with the patience of a woman who understood that gaze because she had worn it herself at 11 and had said nothing, and Lady Blythe had registered the nothing with the faintest shift in her expression, which was not acceptance, but was the absence of immediate dismissal. And Serene had understood that this was, in the economy of Lady Blythe, a significant concession. The Duke was standing when she entered the study. He was not sitting behind the desk, which surprised her, because men who preferred brief meetings generally preferred the desk between them. He was at the window, looking out at the East Garden in the September afternoon, and he turned when Mrs. Calder announced her with the movement of a man who had been thinking about something else and was now required to think about this. He was younger than she had expected. 32, perhaps 33, dark hair, a face that would have been handsome if it had been occupied by any expression at all, but it was not. It was the most completely still face she had ever seen. Not blank, still. The way a lake is still when there is no wind, and the water holds everything beneath the surface without any of it reaching the top. "Miss Lydgate," he said. His voice matched the face, controlled, level, absent of anything that could be mistaken for warmth or its opposite. "Your Grace." He looked at her with the brief, complete assessment, the one that gathered information and offered nothing in return. "You have experience with children of difficult temperament." "I have experience with children," she said. He registered the correction without acknowledging it. "Lady Blythe has not engaged with any of the 4 previous governesses I have employed in the past 2 years. She is intelligent, she is stubborn, and she is angry. And I have been advised by people who consider themselves qualified in these matters that the anger is my responsibility, which may be accurate and is not useful information to me at present. What I require is someone who can educate her despite the difficulty." "Despite it," Serene said, "or through it." He looked at her. It was the first time since she had entered the room that his attention arrived fully. Not the assessment, but something behind it, sharper, less managed. "What do you mean?" "The difficulty is not an obstacle to the education," she said. "It is the education. A child who is angry is a child who is paying attention to something the adults around her have decided not to address. The anger is not the problem. It is the only honest thing in the room." The study was very quiet. The September light had moved behind the ridge, and the room was in the shadow she had predicted, and the Duke of Ashworth was looking at her with an expression she could not catalogue, because it had arrived too quickly for a face that controlled itself this carefully. "You are very direct," he said, "for a governess." "You are very indirect," she said, "for a man who claims to prefer brevity." The silence this time was different. It had edges. "Mrs. Calder will show you the household schedule," he said. "You will begin on Monday. I will not interfere with your methods unless the results require it. I expect weekly reports, written, left on this desk by Friday morning. You will not discuss the family outside this house. You will not discuss Lady Blythe's temperament with visitors or staff beyond what is necessary. And you will not." He paused, and the pause was the first thing about him that was not controlled. "Attempt to address matters that are not within the scope of your position." She looked at him. She thought about the word scope, and what it meant when a duke said it to a governess in a shadowed study and believed he was describing a boundary when he was describing a fear. "Understood, Your Grace," she said. She turned and left the study with the quiet precision of a woman who had heard everything he said and everything he had not said, and had decided that the second category was considerably more important than the first. The first weekly report was left on the Duke's desk on Friday morning, as instructed. It was 1 page. It contained the curriculum she had established, the hours of instruction, the materials she had requested from the library, and at the bottom, a single line about each child. Lord Orrin was progressing well in arithmetic and had asked 14 questions about volcanoes. Lady Blythe had attended every lesson, spoken 0 words, and read the entirety of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman from the library shelf during the geography hour, which Seren had permitted without comment. The Duke read this report. He read it again. He sent no reply. The second report arrived the following Friday. Lord Orrin had progressed to multiplication and had asked 11 questions about earthquakes and 3 about whether horses could swim. Lady Blythe had spoken 4 words, total, across 5 days, those words being, "That map is wrong," and had been correct about the map. Seren had replaced the map. The Duke read this report. He read the line about the map 3 times. He sent no reply. The third Friday, the report was 2 pages. The additional page was a request. Seren had written, in the even, unhurried hand that characterized everything she committed to paper, that she wished to take the children on weekly nature walks through the Ashworth grounds, and that she believed Lady Blythe would benefit from instruction that was not confined to a room she associated with confinement. The word confinement sat on the page with the weight of something that had been placed there deliberately and would not be moved. The Duke summoned her to the study. She arrived at 4. He was behind the desk this time, the report in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the stillness in his face. Do the thing she had been learning to read over 3 weeks, the faint disturbance beneath the surface, the thing that happened when something reached the waterline. "The nature walks," he said. "You believe they are necessary." "I believe they are useful," she said. "I would not use the word necessary without stronger evidence." "The word confinement," he said. "You chose it deliberately. I chose it accurately." He looked at her across the desk for a long moment. She held the look. She did not explain or soften or add a qualifying phrase. She had spent 9 years in houses where qualifying phrases were the currency of survival, and she had decided in the second week at Ashworth Hall that she was not going to do that here, because the children in this house had been surrounded by padding for years, and it had not protected them from anything. "The walks are approved," he said. "Tuesdays and Thursdays. The grounds only. Not the ridge path." She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. She did not turn back. "Lady Blythe chose that book herself, from your library. She chose it because it was the only book in the room that suggested someone in this house believed a woman's mind was worth developing." She paused. The book had been read before. The spine was broken in. Someone in this house read it carefully, a long time ago. She left the study. She closed the door behind her with the soft, precise click of a woman who had just said the most important thing she had said in this house, and had said it with her back turned, and had not waited for a response, because the response was not hers to manage. The Duke sat at his desk in the study that was now fully in shadow, and looked at the door she had closed, and thought about the spine of a book his wife had read 8 years ago, and that he had not been able to move from the shelf since she died. He thought about it for a long time. The nature walks began on a Tuesday in the first week of October, which was the kind of October morning that Dorset produced when it wanted to remind people that England could, on occasion, be beautiful without requiring an apology for the weather. Seren took the children through the east garden, down the terraced slope toward the river, and along the boundary of the home wood, where the beech trees were beginning to turn, and the light came through the canopy in the particular golden way that made even Lord Orrin quiet for 30 seconds at a time. Lady Blythe walked 3 paces behind, which was where she had placed herself, and Seren had not corrected the distance, because distance chosen was different from distance imposed. Lord Orrin walked ahead, investigating every fallen branch and suspicious stone with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who believed the ground contained secrets that adults had inexplicably failed to notice. Seren stopped at the edge of the wood, where a limestone outcrop broke through the soil in a clean, layered line. She knelt beside it and waited. Lord Orrin arrived within seconds. "What is it?" "Limestone," Seren said. "This is the same stone the hall is built from. It was here before the house, before the gardens, before any of it." She ran her finger along the layers. Each of these lines is a different age, thousands of years in each one. The house is 200 years old. This rock does not consider that a significant amount of time. Lord Orrin looked at the rock with the expression of a child whose understanding of time had just been rearranged. Lady Blythe had stopped walking. She was standing 4 paces away instead of 3, which was closer, and she was looking at the limestone with an expression Seren had not seen before. Not the flat, measuring gaze, something less defended than that. "The layers," Lady Blythe said. It was the most she had said in a single unprompted moment since Seren had arrived. "How do you read them?" "I will show you," she said. "Next Tuesday. I will bring the reference books." Lady Blythe turned and walked back toward the house at her own pace, which was 3 paces ahead this time instead of 3 behind. And Seren noted this and said nothing about it, and carried the observation home with the private satisfaction of a woman who understood that some victories were measured in paces. The Friday report that week was 3 pages. The 3rd page was a detailed proposal for a natural philosophy curriculum built around the Ashworth grounds. It included a budget, precisely calculated, because Seren had learned that men who lived in shadowed studies responded to numbers more readily than to arguments. The Duke approved it the same day. He also sent a note, 3 lines, in his own hand, which she recognized because she had been reading his handwriting in the margins of the library books for 3 weeks. "The reference materials you have requested include 2 volumes that are in the study. I will have them sent to the schoolroom. The limestone outcrop at the edge of the home wood is called the Monk's Ledge. The children's mother named it." Seren read the note twice. She read the last sentence 3 times. She put the note in the drawer of the schoolroom desk and thought about a man who could not move a book from a shelf, but could write the name his dead wife had given a rock, and what it meant that he had chosen to tell her in writing rather than in person. By November, the schoolroom had been reorganized. The globe had been moved from the decorative shelf to the work table. The maps were pinned at the children's eye level. The natural history specimens they had collected on walks were arranged on a shelf by the window in a system that Lord Orrin had designed himself, and that Lady Blythe had quietly improved when she thought no one was watching. The books from the Duke's study had arrived as promised. Seren had noticed that one of them, a volume on the geological formations of southern England, had a pressed flower between pages 42 and 43, a small blue wildflower, dry and flat and perfectly preserved, and she had closed the book without removing it and had not mentioned it to anyone. Lady Blythe was speaking, not freely, not in the way Lord Orrin spoke, which was with the indiscriminate generosity of a child who considered every thought worth sharing, but in the way of a person who had decided that certain things were worth saying and was selecting them with care. She spoke about the limestone layers. She spoke about the Latin declensions, which she had opinions about. She described a fox she had seen from the schoolroom window as decided, which was a word that interested Seren considerably, because it was not a word most 11-year-olds reached for, and it told her something about the precision Lady Blythe carried inside the silence. The household had noticed. Mrs. Calder began sending tea to the schoolroom at 11, which she had not done before, and the tea came with biscuits, which was Mrs. Calder's language for approval. The village noticed too. Thornford was small enough that everything at Ashworth Hall eventually became known in Thornford. The new governess had lasted longer than the others. The new governess, it was generally agreed, was quiet, which in Thornford was either a compliment or a diagnosis, depending on who was speaking. The Reverend Mr. Aldrich Oakes, who held the living at Thornford, and who considered himself the social conscience of the valley, called at Ashworth Hall in the 3rd week of November. One Mrs. Calder received him in the housekeeper's parlor and offered him tea and the minimum viable quantity of information. "She has been here since September," Mr. Oakes said. "That is longer than the last 4 combined." "Miss Lydgate is competent," Mrs. Calder said. "And His Grace, is His Grace satisfied with the arrangement?" Mrs. Calder looked at Mr. Oakes with the expression of a woman who had been managing the distance between a duke's private affairs and the village's curiosity for 15 years. "His Grace has not expressed dissatisfaction," she said. Mr. Oakes departed with the particular energy of a clergyman who had new information to distribute, even if the information was the absence of information, which in Thornford carried its own significant weight. The Friday reports continued. They had become, without either Serene or the Duke acknowledging it, something more than reports. The final paragraphs had evolved. Lady Blythe had laughed during the Thursday walk, once, at something Lord Orrin had said about a beetle. The laugh had been brief and startled, as though it had escaped before she could prevent it. Lord Orrin had labeled the limestone outcrop, the Monk's Ledge, on a map he drew from memory, without being told the name, which meant someone had told him, and the only person who could have told him was his father. The Duke read these paragraphs on Friday mornings in the study that was in its morning light, which was a change, because he had previously read them in the afternoon shadow, which meant he had moved the reading to a time when the room was brighter, which was a detail Serene would not have known and did not know, but which Mrs. Calder knew and noted and kept entirely to herself. The first rain of December flooded the river path and closed the route they had been using for the Thursday walks. The practical solution required asking the Duke for permission to use the ridge path, which he had specifically excluded from the approved grounds. Serene considered writing the request in the Friday report and decided against it. The report was for information. This was a negotiation. Negotiations required presence. She arrived at 4. He was at the window, which she had learned was where he stood when he was thinking about something he had not finished thinking about. "The ridge path," she said without preliminary. "It is not suitable for children," he said, still at the window. "It is not suitable for unattended children," she said. "The children would be attended. By me." He turned. "The path is narrow in places. The drop to the east is considerable. I have walked it. Twice. On my own time. Lady Blythe has been asking about the chalk layers that are exposed on the eastern face, which I cannot adequately teach from a book." "Lady Blythe has been asking," he said. "Yes." He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 3 months, the one that happened when something about the children reached the surface of the still water. "She is asking questions." "She is asking geological questions," Serene said. "She is not yet asking personal ones. The geological ones are a reasonable place to begin." "You are asking me to trust your judgment," he said. "I am asking you to observe it," she said. "You have my reports. You have 3 months of evidence." "Tuesday and Thursday," he said. "The ridge path. I will walk it with you first. Tomorrow. 9 in the morning." She had not expected this. She had expected permission or refusal. She had not expected him to come himself. "Miss Lydgate." She stopped at the door. "The book," he said. The geological volume I sent to the schoolroom. There is a pressed flower between pages 42 and 43. She waited. My wife collected wildflowers, he said. He was looking at the window. She pressed them in whatever book she was reading at the time. I have found them in 30 or 40 volumes over the years. I did not remember that one was in the geology book until after I sent it. The silence in the study was the kind that required care. He was not asking her to respond. He was telling her something, and the telling was the act. I did not remove it, she said. It is still between the pages. She left the study, and she thought about a man who had found his dead wife's pressed flowers in 30 or 40 books over 8 years, and had left every one of them where it was, and had just told a governess about it in December. She arrived at the conclusion that she was going to have to be very careful, because the thing she was beginning to feel was not within the scope of any position she had ever held, and she had never been particularly good at staying within scope. The ridge walk the following morning was cold and clear in the way of Dorset in December, the valley visible below them in its winter state, the village smoke rising in thin lines against the gray sky. The Duke walked ahead on the narrow section, testing the path with the attention of a man who took physical responsibility seriously, and Seren walked behind him and watched the way he moved on his own land, which was different from the way he moved in the study. Less controlled, more present. He stopped at the eastern lookout, where the chalk face was exposed in a clean white line against the darker earth. "The chalk layers," she said, standing beside him. "This is what Lady Blythe has been asking about. You cannot teach this from a diagram." "No," he said. He was looking at the valley. "My wife used to walk this path every morning, before the children were born and after, when she was well enough." He paused. "I closed it after she died. I told myself it was safety. The narrow section, the drop." He looked at the chalk face. It wasn't safety. Seren stood beside him on the ridge and thought about a man who had closed a path because his wife had walked it and had called it safety and had believed it for 8 years. "The path is sound," she said. "Not gently, not softly," with the same voice she used for the Friday reports. "The children will be safe on it, and Lady Blythe needs to see this." "Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said. "The ridge path is approved." He walked back down toward the hall, though she stood on the ridge for a moment longer and thought about scope and the edges of it, and how they had moved since September, and where they were now, which was somewhere she could not precisely map, which was unusual for her, because she could usually map anything. Christmas at Ashworth Hall was observed with the precision of a household that understood the forms and had lost the feeling for them. Seren had not expected to be included at the tenants' dinner, and was. She was aware, during the conversation, that the Duke was watching from the head of the table. Not visibly, but she had developed over 4 months a working sense of where his attention was directed, and it was directed, with a frequency she noted and set aside, toward her end of the table. After dinner, Mrs. Calder appeared at her elbow in the corridor. "Lord Orrin asked His Grace this morning whether you would be staying through the winter. His Grace said yes. Lord Orrin said good and returned to his breakfast. Lady Blythe said nothing, which His Grace understood, and which I understood, and which I believe you would also understand." "Lady Blythe's silence on the subject," Seren said, "is the most reliable indicator of her position." "Yes," Mrs. Calder said. She paused. "His Grace read the last 3 Friday reports twice. I know this because the reports were on his desk on Friday morning, and on his desk again on Saturday morning, which is not something he does with correspondence he has finished with." "Thank you, Mrs. Calder." "I am not telling you anything," Mrs. Calder said. "I am observing the household, which is my function." Seren stood in the corridor for a moment after Mrs. Calder had gone, and went to the schoolroom and sat at her desk in the dark for 10 minutes before lighting the candle. January brought the Thornford Winter Assembly. Seren was not invited because governesses were not invited to assemblies, and she spent the evening in the schoolroom with Lady Blythe, who was too young to attend and too aware to pretend she did not care, and Lord Orrin, who had fallen asleep by the fire at 7. Lady Blythe said, without looking up from her book, "Were you ever invited to assemblies?" "Before?" It was the first personal question Lady Blythe had asked her. "Yes," she said. "Before I was a governess. My family had a position that included invitations." "What happened to the position?" "Money," Seren said. "The position required money, and the money went away, and the position went with it." Lady Blythe looked at her book. "My mother had a position," she said. "She was a duchess, and then she was ill, and then she was dead. And the position went away too, except it did not, because Father still has it, and we still have it. But the part of it that was her is gone, and everyone behaves as though the position is the same when it is not the same at all." The schoolroom was very quiet. The fire made its sounds. Seren looked at Lady Blythe, who was 11, and who had just said the truest thing anyone in this house had said in Serene's hearing, and who was looking at her book with the fixed attention of a child who had said something enormous, and was waiting to see whether the adult in the room would make it smaller. "No," Seren said. "It is not the same at all, and you are right to say so." Lady Blythe looked at her. Her eyes were bright and furious and precise, and Seren thought, "She is not angry. She has never been angry. She has been accurate, and no one has been willing to confirm it." "Would you like to hear about the assemblies I attended?" Seren said. "They were not grand, but on one occasion a vicar fell into the punch bowl, which remains the most entertaining thing I have witnessed at a social gathering." Lady Blythe did not smile, but the fixed quality in her expression loosened, fractionally, and she said, "Tell me about the vicar." And the evening passed in the schoolroom with the fire and the story and the quiet that was no longer silence, but something else. Something like trust. The Duke returned from the assembly at 10. Seren sat at the schoolroom desk and wrote the Friday report early on a Wednesday evening, because she needed to write the thing she could not say aloud, which was that Lady Blythe had spoken about her mother for the first time, and that the child was not damaged. The child was grieving. And grief in a house that had made silence a policy was not healing, it was calcifying. She wrote the word, calcifying. She looked at it. She did not soften it. She left the report on the Duke's desk before breakfast on Thursday morning, a day early, because some things should not wait for their scheduled delivery. The Reverend Mr. Oakes held a parish dinner in the second week of February. 12 people at the table. The Duke at the head, beside Mr. Oakes. Seren at the lower end, between the Coldest family and a widow named Mrs. Fen Draycott, who owned the small estate at the western end of the valley, and who had the particular conversational energy of a woman who lived alone and stored up her observations for occasions when she had an audience. "The ridge path," Mr. Oakes said from the head of the table, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to addressing rooms from a pulpit. "I understand the children are walking the ridge now. That is a change from the previous arrangement." "The curriculum includes natural philosophy," Seren said. "The ridge provides access to geological formations that supplement the classroom instruction." "I wonder," Mr. Oakes said, "whether a governess's curriculum requires quite so much time out of doors. The previous governesses, as I recall, kept to the schoolroom." "The previous governesses," Seren said, "did not stay long enough to establish a curriculum." A small sound from Mrs. Draycott's direction that might have been a laugh suppressed into a cough. "I merely observe," he said, "that the role of a governess is a specific one. I do not question your competence, Miss Lydgate. I question whether the scope of the position has perhaps been expanded beyond what is customary or advisable. The word scope. Seren heard it and thought about the same word in the Duke's study in September, and about the distance between what the Duke had meant by it and what Mr. Oakes meant by it, which were not the same thing, but which arrived at the same destination, which was a line drawn around what a woman in her position was permitted to do. She was formulating her response when the Duke spoke. "The curriculum at Ashworth Hall," the Duke said, in a voice she had not heard before, the one that came from the same place as the limestone and the hall itself, old and settled and carrying the weight of 200 years of this valley, "was designed by Miss Lydgate, with my knowledge, my review, and my explicit approval. The nature walks, including the ridge path, are conducted under my authority. The progress of my children under Miss Lydgate's instruction has been more substantial in 5 months than in the previous 2 years combined. If anyone at this table has questions about the scope of Miss Lydgate's position, they may direct those questions to me." He did not raise his voice. He looked at Mr. Oakes with the still, complete attention, the one that had been directed at Seren in September and was now directed at someone else, and the attention said everything the voice had not. Mr. Oakes received the statement with the grace of a man who understood that he had reached the boundary of what was permitted. "Of course, Your Grace. The children are fortunate." "Mrs." Draycott leaned toward Seren during the cheese course. "I have lived in this valley for 22 years, Miss Lydgate, and I have never heard the Duke of Ashworth say that many words in sequence at a dinner table. Not once. Not about anything." He was clarifying a professional arrangement, Seren said. Mrs. Draycott looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been lonely long enough to recognize the full spectrum of what people said when they were not saying the thing they meant. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what he was doing." After dinner, in the narrow corridor of the parsonage, the Duke passed her on his way to the carriage. He did not stop. But he said, as he passed, in the low, level voice that was just for her and just for the corridor, "The Friday report this week, the one about Lady Blythe." She stopped. "Yes?" "You used the word calcifying." He paused. He was looking at the door ahead of him. It was the right word. He left. She stood in the corridor and understood that the scope of what was happening between them had moved beyond any boundary she knew how to survey. He came to the schoolroom. This was unprecedented. In 6 months, the Duke of Ashworth had not entered the schoolroom. The schoolroom was Serene's territory, the way the study was his, and the separation had been maintained with the mutual understanding of 2 people who knew that boundaries were easier to observe than to restore once crossed. He came on a Saturday morning in March, when the children were with Mrs. Calder in the village for the spring market, and Seren was alone at her desk, preparing the week's natural philosophy lesson on the life cycle of the common frog, because Lord Orrin had been asking about tadpoles with the urgency of a child who had discovered that animals could change shape and required immediate explanations. She heard his step in the corridor. She knew it was his, and she had approximately 4 seconds between hearing it and seeing him in the doorway, which was enough time to understand that something had changed and not enough time to prepare for it. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the schoolroom, at the globe, and the maps, and the specimens, and the pressed flower geology book. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man seeing a room he had avoided and finding that the room had become something he had not expected. "I owe you an account of something," he said. He did not sit. He stood in the doorway, as though he understood that entering fully would mean something neither of them could retract. "In September, the word I used was scope. I told you not to address matters beyond the scope of your position." "I remember," she said. "I was not talking about the position," he said. I was talking about myself. I was telling you not to come too close to the thing I had built around this house and these children." He stopped. "I lost my wife 8 years ago. Her name was Rosalind. She died of a fever that came in autumn and did not leave. She was 24. Lady Blythe was not yet 3. Lord Orrin was not yet born." The schoolroom was very quiet. The Duke of Ashworth was standing in the doorway of a room he had not entered in 6 months, telling a governess the thing the house had been built around, not saying. "I built the silence after she died," he said. "I built it because the silence was manageable and the grief was not. I told myself the children needed stability, and I gave them silence instead. And I called it the same thing, and the 4 governesses who came before you believed it too, or pretended to, and left when the pretending became too difficult." He looked at her. "You did not pretend. You wrote me the word confinement in the 3rd week, and you found Rosalind's book and did not remove the flower, and you asked me about the ridge path, and I came myself because I could not think of a reason not to that was honest, and you used the word calcifying about my daughter, and it was the right word, and I have read every report you have written, and I have read them twice, and I cannot." He stopped. "I cannot maintain the scope I described in September. It is no longer accurate." Seren sat at her desk. She looked at the man in the doorway and understood that the reports had been reaching him, not as an employer reading an employee's account, but as a person reading the only honest voice in his household. "I knew," she said, "about the silence. I knew what it was when I arrived. The advertisement told me. Silence underlined twice. That is not a household requirement. That is a man telling the world what he cannot bear to hear. I did not come here to dismantle it," she said. "But I arrived and I met Lady Blythe, and I understood that the silence was not protecting her. It was teaching her that the most important thing in her life was not permitted to exist in speech. And I could not maintain the scope you described either." "The reports," he said. "They were not just reports." "No." "What were they?" "They were the only way I could talk to you," she said, "about the things that mattered, without crossing the line you had drawn. I could write them and leave them on your desk and walk away, and the walking away was the only thing that made the honesty bearable." "Seren," he said. Her name. The first time. Not Miss Lydgate. The specific, irreplaceable sound of her name in his voice, and she heard 8 years of silence break in the 2 syllables of it, and she understood that the threshold he had not crossed was not the doorway. "Come in," she said. He came into the schoolroom. He sat in the chair beside the work table, the one Lord Orrin sat in for arithmetic, which was too small for him, and which he sat in anyway, and the wrongness of it, the Duke of Ashworth in a child's chair, in a schoolroom on a Saturday morning, was the most human thing she had seen him do. She did not move from behind the desk. This was her room and her desk, and if this conversation was going to happen, it was going to happen on her terms, the way he had conducted the September interview on his. "I need to say something," she said. He waited. He was learning to wait, she thought. He had not been a man who waited in September. "I am a governess because my father lost his fortune when I was 17, and my education became the only thing of value I possessed. What I do has a position in the world, and the position is below yours, and I am not confused about that." She raised her hand before he could speak. "The thing that is happening between us cannot happen without both of us understanding what it costs me. You are a duke. If you develop an attachment to your governess, the county will talk about your judgment. If I develop an attachment to my employer, the county will talk about my character. These are not the same cost." "I understand it," he said. "I have understood it since the parsonage dinner. I spoke because the cost of not speaking was higher than the cost of what Mr. Oakes would conclude. He looked at the geology book on the reference shelf. Rosalind, he said, and the name arrived in the schoolroom with the weight of 8 years. Rosalind would have liked you. She would have liked the reports. She would have read them aloud to me on Friday evenings and told me which parts I had failed to understand. And she would have been right. I am not Rosalind, she said. I will not be a replacement for Rosalind. And I will not be the quiet version of a wife you have already lost. No, he said. You are the loudest, quiet person I have ever encountered. You have dismantled 8 years of policy with a weekly report and a refusal to remove a pressed flower from a book. You are the thing I did not know to look for, because I was looking for silence, and you gave me something that was shaped like silence, but was not silence at all. She stood. She came around the desk. She stood in front of the child's chair where the Duke of Ashworth was sitting, and she looked down at him. And the looking down was not a reversal of power. It was the absence of the question of power, which was different, which was better. Stand up, she said. He stood. They were close, in the schoolroom, in the March light. I'm going to do something, she said. That is not within the scope of my position. She put her hand on his chest. Flat. Deliberate. Over the place where the still water was, and she felt the surface break, and he put his hand over hers and held it. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the quality of a man who had been reading evidence for 6 months and had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to act on. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to Latin declensions and geological surveys and every true thing she had ever committed to paper. And the schoolroom was warm, and the March morning was outside, and the tadpole diagrams were between them, and none of it required a report. When they separated, she kept her hand on his chest and looked at him. The Friday reports, she said. I will continue writing them. I would be disappointed if you did not. They will be more honest, she said, now that the scope has been revised. The scope has been comprehensively revised. Good, she said. I will note it in the report. He proposed on a Wednesday, which wasn't the day for proposals in the conventional understanding of how proposals worked, but they had arrived at each other through Friday reports and Saturday mornings and the unconventional route of limestone outcrops and pressed flowers, and Wednesday seemed as defensible as any other day. He proposed in the schoolroom because that was where she was, and because proposing in the study would have returned them to September. He arrived at 11, while the children were at their Latin, and stood in the doorway, and Lady Blythe looked up from her declensions, and Lord Orrin looked up from his, and the Duke of Ashworth said, with the directness he had learned from her and the brevity he had always possessed, Miss Lydgate, I would like to marry you, and I am aware that this is not the appropriate venue or the appropriate moment, and I find that I do not care about either of those things, and I would like your answer. Lord Orrin said, Does this mean Miss Lydgate stays forever? Lady Blythe said nothing. She looked at Sir Wren. She looked at her father. She looked at the doorway he was standing in, the same doorway, the threshold he had crossed in March, and was now standing at again, with a question that was not about scope or reports or geological formations. Serene looked at Lady Blythe. She looked at Lord Orrin. She looked at the man in the doorway. Yes, she said. Lord Orrin returned to his Latin with the satisfied efficiency of a child who had received the answer he wanted and considered the matter closed. Lady Blythe looked at Sir Wren for 1 moment longer, and Sir Wren saw in her expression something she had not seen before, not the flat measuring gaze, not the fury. Something softer and more frightened and more hopeful, and Sir Wren understood that the yes had been heard by everyone in the room, but it had been answered to Lady Blythe. The Duke crossed the threshold. He came to the desk. Sir Wren stood, and he took her hand. and Lady Blythe watched this happen with the expression of a child seeing something she had stopped believing was possible, and did not look away. "Edmund," she said. His name. She had learned it from Mrs. Calder in December, had carried it unused for months, and now it arrived in the schoolroom between the lesson plans and the Latin declensions, and he looked at her when she said it as though something had been completed. "Friday's report," she said, holding his hand. "I will need to include this." "I would expect nothing less," he said. The county learned of the engagement through the channels the county always used. Mrs. Calder told Mr. Collis's wife, who told Mrs. Draycott, who told the Reverend Mr. Oakes, who told the remaining families, and by the following Sunday, the entire valley knew that the Duke of Ashworth was marrying his governess. Mrs. Draycott arrived at Ashworth Hall on Friday with a bottle of wine from her late husband's cellar and the energy of a woman who had been waiting for something interesting to happen in this valley for a decade. Mr. Collis told the Duke during the spring planting review that he was glad and that Rosalind would have been glad, and the Duke received this with the stillness that Serene had learned was not the absence of feeling, but the careful management of more feeling than the face was designed to show. Mr. Oakes said the right things in the right order, with the careful grace of a man who had recalibrated his position on the governess, with the precision of a clergyman who recognized that the scope of what was appropriate had shifted permanently. Mrs. Calder said nothing about the engagement directly, but a vase of fresh flowers appeared on Serene's desk one morning without explanation, and Serene understood that this was Mrs. Calder's version of a full and comprehensive endorsement. Lady Blythe gave her endorsement differently. On the Thursday walk after the engagement, on the ridge path at the eastern lookout, Lady Blythe stood beside Serene and said, without looking at her, "My mother would have liked the walks." Serene stood beside her in the spring wind and understood that this was not a comparison and not a blessing. It was Lady Blythe telling her that the walks had reached the place the geology had not been able to reach on its own, and that the place was personal, and that she was permitting Serene to know it. "I think she would have," Serene said, and they stood on the ridge together, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that wasn't the absence of speech, but the presence of something that didn't require it. They were married in June, in the village church at Thornford, with the stone floors that had been there since the 14th century, and the east window that caught the morning light in the way that old glass caught light, imperfectly and beautifully. She wore blue, not white, because she had decided that white was a convention and blue was a fact. The color of the pressed wildflowers in the geology book, the color of the sky over the ridge path on the December morning he had walked it with her, the color of the thing she had felt in the schoolroom in March when he said her name for the first time. The valley turned out. Mrs. Draycott cried, openly and without apology. Mr. Oakes performed the ceremony with professional composure. Mrs. Calder sat in the third pew with Tilda and Rena, and the expression of a woman who had been managing this household through 8 years of silence, and was now managing it through something else, something louder, something better. Lady Blythe stood at the front of the church beside Lord Orrin. She wore green because she had chosen it herself, and Serene had not interfered with the choice, and Lady Blythe had registered the non-interference with the faintest expression that was becoming, week by week, more like a smile and less like a concession. Serene walked into the church on no one's arm because she had no father to walk with and no family present, and she had decided that walking alone was not an absence, but a statement. And the statement was that she had arrived at this place under her own power, through her own work, through 9 years of governess positions and Latin declensions and managed silence, and she was not going to pretend that the arrival was anything other than what it was. which was earned. She reached the front of the church. The Duke of Ashworth looked at her with the expression that had nothing of September in it, nothing of the still water, nothing of the controlled surface. The full, unmanaged attention of a man who had spent 8 years in silence and had been reached by a woman who had written her way through it, one Friday report at a time. She thought about the final Friday report, the one she had written that morning, the one she had left on the desk in the study before coming to the church, the one that said, in the even, unhurried hand that characterized everything she committed to paper, "Weekly report. Final entry in the current format. Lady Blythe spoke about her mother twice this week, once to me and once to her father. Lord Orrin has completed his multiplication tables and has begun asking questions about fractions. The geology curriculum will resume on Tuesday with the summer fossils in the riverbed. The tadpoles in the South Pond have completed their metamorphosis." And at the bottom, in the same hand, without separation or ceremony, "I love you. This is not within the scope of my position. I am including it in the report because the reports have always been where I put the true things, and this is the truest thing I have. S. Lydgate." She had left it on his desk at 7 in the morning. She did not know if he had read it before the church. She did not need to know. The report was the act. The leaving it was the honesty. The walking away was the discipline. And the arriving here, in this church, in this blue dress, on her own 2 feet, was everything that came after the walking away, which was the walking toward. She took his hand. He held it with the grip of a man who had been holding nothing for 8 years, and was now holding something, and was not going to let go. "Seren," he said. "Edmund," she said. And his name in her voice, and her name in his, had all of September, and October, and December, and March, and every Friday morning in them, and none of it was silence anymore. The church was quiet. The valley was outside. The chalk ridge was visible through the east window, the exposed layers of the earth that told the truth about time. And the truth was that some things took longer than expected and arrived by routes that could not be predicted. And the best evidence was always the evidence you understood better after you had gathered it than before. She had gathered it. She understood it completely.